And I am going to share my screen. So thanks everyone for joining the third session of the Lead with APAMSA. And then this is our mission, and it's recognizing the lack of a NHPI and leadership roles in medicine. PAMSA leadership program aims to empower the next generation of and happy medical profession by providing them with the skills, mentoring, and guidance to develop as emerging leaders in medicine. And then these are some of our team. Some of the leadership committee are also joined in this Zoom link. Throughout the session, if you have any questions, you can feel free to send it to us via chat, or you can send it to me, and I'll post it for our speaker. Today we have Knowing Yourself with Dr. Nolan Kagetsu and Dr. Lindy Zhang. And just for a brief introduction of our two speakers, who are also both on our alumni advisory board. So thank you for both of our speakers. Dr. Nolan Kagetsu studied chemical engineering at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology after graduating from Albany Medical College before the creation of APAMSA. He completed a residency in diagnostic radiology at Mount Sinai West and a fellowship in diagnostic and interventional neuroradiology at NYU. He currently is a diagnostic neuroradiologist at Mount Sinai in New York City. Dr. Kagetsu serves on the APAMSA Alumni Advisory Board, the American College of Radiology Commission for Women and Diversity, and the Advisory Committee for ACGME Office of Diversity. He has written about unconscious bias, microaggression, and being an upstander. He is a professor of radiology and medical education at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai. He has 2 adult children and lives with his wife in New York City. And feel free to follow him on his Twitter account on Kagetsu and Instagram at NYC Neural Raid. And then our next speaker is Dr. Lindy Zhang. She's currently a pediatric hematology oncology clinical and research fellow at the Johns Hopkins Hospital and National Institute of Health Combined Program, and a PhD candidate at the Cellular and Molecular Medicine program at Johns Hopkins School of Medicine. She completed her Bachelor of Science in Biochemistry at the University of Michigan and her medical degree at the Albert Einstein College of Medicine. She is the child of Chinese immigrant and the first in her family to pursue a post-bachelor degree. She is passionate about diversity and inclusion and conducts research focused on increasing Asian American representation in academic medicine. She is a member of the APAMSA Alumni Advisory Board and is invested in the membership promoting sponsorship among Asian American medical students and increasing their diversity within academic. And I would like to thank all the speakers for attending, and I'll let you share your screen.
All right. So just shout out these are Dr. Zhang's slides, and I adopted them for this presentation. But thank you for the invitation, and we'll try to advance. There we go. So here's our objectives. We are asked to talk about reflecting on our leadership style and role, how we grew and evolved as leaders, strengths and weaknesses, setting boundaries, when to say no, and to talk about a little bit about unconscious bias. So the first one, I guess I'll hand off to Dr. Zhang.
Yeah, hi. Thanks for having me at this presentation. Like Dr. Kaketsu said, I put these slides together for a separate presentation I'd given before about kind of balancing roles, and I think very appropriate for this topic as well. So feel free to ask questions, or if there's something you want to know more about or something else you want to talk about, definitely we're both open to it. This is pretty kind of way back presentation. But I just wanted to talk first about just the many hats in our lives. As someone, when you heard my biography, I've done many things and still continue to do many things. I went to medical school, did some research, did pediatric residency, and then am in now my fellowship. And I chose to stay at Hopkins for my fellowship mainly because they also had this PhD program. And so now I'm a PhD graduate student on top of trying to be a clinician and see patients in clinic and do grad work and also do research. And then on the side, I do a lot of things with the APAMSA, mainly being on the alumni board, doing some research on microaggression, and really trying to find ways to help with mentorship. And so kind of thinking about myself, but also hoping you guys are reflecting on some of the things you do and some of the things you want to be involved in, or the people you want to be when you get an MD or you are already, kind of how you really define yourself and how do you really introduce yourself. I always have this question for myself, is kind of how do I give my elevator pitch when I want to talk about, I do research in pediatric oncology, and I look at the microenvironment in a tumor called MPNST, but I also do all of this diversity research in Asian Americans, and how do you kind of put that together? I don't know if anyone else in the audience want to talk a little bit about how you guys think about this, or what questions you have, or how do you find yourself trying to balance some of the different interests and strengths in your lives.
This is more bio. Well, should we go to the next?
Yeah. And so I wanted to kind of have us think a little bit about how you would define yourself. So for me, I think, self-reflection is really important, particularly for someone who, really, like I said, chooses to do too much, and kind of not trying to overwhelm yourself or overburden yourself by saying yes to everything. And how do you kind of think about who you are and what things you should be doing to help that image of yourself, and really not miss the forest for the trees. I'm sure, people come up with projects all the time, and you can get involved in every organization you want, but kind of thinking about how do you package yourself, but also how do you stay true to yourself in that kind of forest of trees. So really thinking about how do you really truly know what your strengths are, and know what is important to you. One of the biggest advice I always give, undergrads, medical students, residents, is really to not do things that you think you should be doing. People always say, hey, you should do research so it's on your resume when you apply for residency, and so you can get into residency. And if you truly hate research and you don't want to build an academic medicine doing research, that's probably not what you should do. It's probably something you think you should be doing. And so really kind of being honest with yourself of what do you think you are good at and what is important to you in your life. If APAMSA is really important to you, then that's something you should invest time into, not because it's another checkbox in your resume, but that it really makes you whole. And I think sometimes reflecting on some of those things can help you think about how to say no thank you to things that don't serve you. I will caution, it's kind of a fine line to walk when you say no thank you to things, but not saying it too early, where you close your door into something that potentially might be meaningful for you. Next slide. So I was hoping, this would be more interactive, and maybe Dr. Kaketsu or anyone else can kind of jump in and just kind of thinking about who you are or who you want to be, reflecting on, what are the things that really makes you feel whole, and what steps do you need to take to get there? And really in a leadership position is kind of, for myself, early on in my career, I always ask myself this of what is my next goal to get to where I am, and how do I prioritize things? For some self-reflection, I've always knew I wanted to do academic medicine. I really love to teach. I love medical education. And research has always been a part of my life. And so figuring out the first step was, how do I be a clinician seeing patients, but also doing teaching as well as doing some research? And then kind of, exploring opportunities of what that balance looks like for different people, because obviously you can't have it all at the same time, is what I'm told. But kind of thinking about, what things make me feel like myself, and what things do I feel like I need to be involved in.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's important to have, say, a panel of mentors, advisors, because certainly when you start out on this path, you can say, hey, do you want to do this project? But then I tell residents even, like, you do that, you're going to do all this work and you're not going to end up with a PMID number that will show it's more of a legit piece of work. So if you do it just to kind of get a taste of research, just do one of these pieces and then, oh, I was asked to do a case report. And in some ways that's an opportunity, but a case report doesn't really help you in the scheme of things. For academic, if you're after academic promotion, a case report is not so valuable. The way I think they look at it is that, any schmo could have stumbled onto an interesting case and they just wrote it up. So you almost have to get so-called original research. And Dr. Zhang has some rock star project for you, the PhD. I mean, that's really legit research, but sometimes you can even find a clinical problem and perhaps kind of a novel site into a clinical problem. I think that's more or less the path I ended up taking.
Yeah, and I will say, even earlier in career, case report, it is easy, but I think I wrote one up as a resident and didn't get published until I was a fellow on a baby who came with thrombocytopenia. But it also teaches you, and I mean, this is why I say not saying no too early, is that it taught me what it was to go through a publication, kind of getting a paper to publication, like submitting it, getting feedback about it and rewriting it, or like who to talk to and how to get everybody on the same page and how to like write a meaningful paper from a case report. I think there is a lot to be learned from the things you do that you don't recognize up front.
Right. And let's try, what else do we have?
I just wanted to pose one question real quick that was brought up. Like it was like you mentioned in terms of like self-awareness, reflection. As the question is, as students, we have like a variety of priorities to reach our career goals, especially since you guys are pretty established now, but as we're trying to figure out where we want to go to, how do you recommend us to continue to be like self-aware, or how should we figure out when we should check in with ourselves at different stages of our life?
That's a really good question. And I think we probably both have different answers. And I think part of it is, what kind of person you are and your personality. I'm all about kind of individualized plans. For myself, I'm very goal oriented and very kind of to-do list timely. And so for me, it's really kind of thinking about, what is my end goal, and like and I think there are a couple of slides about how do you get there, and kind of breaking it down, going backwards. So if your end goal is to get an academic medicine career after residency, then what do you have to do during residency to do that, right? Like learn to publish or do a little bit of research, and kind of really being practical with yourself. Is, being a resident is very hard. You're working 80 hours a week. You don't have that much time. Are you truly willing to sacrifice your free time to do research and to write a paper? And if your end goal really means that much to you, you will make that time and effort. But if your goal is to come out and, run a private practice and, have a family, then potentially your to-do list looks very different from someone who has the goal to, climb the academic ladder. And I think, keeping different time points of keeping some of these goals. Some people do it yearly, some people do it every 6 months. Really kind of recognizing that in yourself. And when you start to feel overwhelmed, sometimes that's a good time to kind of pause and be like, hey, is this really like too much on my plate? Or do all of these things really mean something to me?
I think one technique of self-reflection is actually to use meditation, although I only started that as an attending, so I don't know how I got through medical school or training, but perhaps it was just good advisors. I had the advice early on that it's easier to switch from academic pathway to private practice. Some of the people would jokingly say it's going pro. That tends to be easier, although I have had residents that went from residency to private practice and were kind of disillusioned or whatever, and then came back to, one's now an attending at NYU. So it's not impossible, but I have heard that advice where, start off in academics. I mean, in some ways, I think a common path is if you're a fellow, you stay on as an attending at the same place. Hopefully they'll like you and have an opening, and I won't be surprised if Dr. Zhang is going to stay on one more year at least. And then they say that sometimes that first year as an attending, you learn as much or more as your fellowship year, because all of a sudden you're making all these decisions and you realize that, putting into practice all this knowledge it's a very good year. I ended up staying at NYU. I did fellowship at NYU for like 2 years, and I stayed at NYU for 1 extra year. And yeah, it was and then I semi-academic place, and I've been there ever since. Answers the question, but
Yeah, and I would like to say the things that I've learned these last couple of years really is also being flexible with where you want to go and your goals. I think, things change, your situation changes, like relationships come and go, or like family stuff happens. And so I think being flexible and really, I think some of that self-reflection comes in of like, it may not look like what you thought it will in 5 years, but that you always kept your priorities and what's important to you in mind, that you will end up being happy no matter what that end point looks like.
I guess I will say that some of the advice is a lot easier to do the more senior you are, because you tend to have a little more control over your life, like saying no. I can do that, but it's harder for a student to say no, especially it's a little awkward if you're a more senior person asked you to do a project. One of the strategies that if they tell me if I'm asked to do something, I'll say, I don't know if I have the bandwidth for that, but why don't you try this other person, and you offer somebody else that may actually benefit. So if you've already done a case report, then you should, let somebody else case report, something like that. And at least you've helped the person asking you, they've helped them with that project. So if you can help them by getting someone else, and that's a good thing. One thing to be aware of is that when you do a publication, different institutions have different rules, but I don't know, at Mount Sinai, you get equal credit if you're first, second, or last author. I don't know. How is it at your place, Dr. Zhang?
I don't know, particularly for kind of promotions.
Yeah, that would be my mentoring tip for you, is to look at, check in with you're at a very prestigious place, so they may have a different.
Yeah, I suspect it's a little bit different, because I think some of my attendings who are trying to jump from assistant to associate has to have like an X number of last authors and then X number of first author papers,
right.
And then like a handful of middle authors.
Yeah, I was almost surprised to be that number 2 got any credit at all.
Yeah.
And then it's interesting because I know, it was unfortunate that, I did all the work. Theoretically, I should be first author, but they made me like last. But then in fact, it doesn't matter, because if there's 3 authors, they all count equally, first, second, or last. So as it turns out, so maybe that's karma or something, but
Any other
things like
questions?
when you go into a project, you really should from the get-go kind of saying, oh, so if I write this up, will I be first author, right? Because that's uncool if they want to steal that from you.
Yeah, and definitely, hopefully, you guys will find good mentors, but that's definitely a awkward but a necessary conversation to have, particularly if you join a project. Is kind of like, where do you fall in the authorship? Because it really, like, if they've already guaranteed people first and second authorship, you don't want to go in and have them make you write the whole paper, right? And then you don't get first and second because someone already has that. I've been very fortunate of having really great mentors who've protected me from that and been very straightforward up front, but definitely something to kind of keep in mind, particularly when you're writing papers with other people.
I do remember some of my first things I got involved in, I got was mentioned in the acknowledgments, which is, there's no, that doesn't really, the only thing that helps you is to get to the next step. So all those acknowledgments have now dropped off my CV, but I think they think, and that's something you can maybe mention in an essay, that I worked on a project with this team and whatever, and perhaps there's a way to put it in as a kind of a trainee version of a CV. But for academic promotion, they don't necessarily care about acknowledgments. But you got to start somewhere, and I think
Yeah, there's a question in the chat from Rachel. How do you know that you wanted to further pursue academia rather than be a full-time practicing physician? What about research excites you? And I just wanted to clarify, being in academic medicine doesn't mean you're not a full-time practicing physician. I think it depends on where your efforts are going in terms of seeing patients and doing clinical work. And I think there is a really, and I didn't know this even when I was a resident, that there is this large array of different jobs out there where the amount of effort going into clinicals is very different. Big institutions like this, we always, quote the 80-20 model, where you do 80% research and 20% clinical work. But it really just depends on how you're bringing in money for the institution, of like how much of your 100% time effort is spent in different areas of your job. And so I think in academia, that kind of model fluctuates based on what kind of role you play. Some people are clinicians who do some clinical research, mostly some education, and then really see patients mostly either with residents or by themselves. And then the model here at Hopkins is really, you do mostly research, you bring in grant money, and then you'll do time on service and see patients in clinic, at least for myself. For me, I've always known I loved research. I did it as a college student for 4 years, and I briefly thought about doing a PhD or an MD PhD until I went to a seminar as a college student and watched graduate students talk about the research and realized that their whole life is dependent on finding like a particular protein or a certain pathway, and it really kind of freaked me out. And I love being in the hospital and I love seeing patients, and so I decided to pursue an MD, and I don't regret it at all. And I think that will be a part of my career I never want to give up, is seeing patients and being on service. But I continue to kind of figure out ways and talk to people about how I could continue doing research. So I did some clinical research. I did a bunch of medical education research and QI work, and then this opportunity to do a fellowship, to do a PhD opened up for me. So I started to do bench research, and I do really enjoy it. And so I kept doing it. And I think for me, I was very fortunate because every step of the way, I've always had really great mentors. Even as a resident, I had a mentor who was like, okay, like, let's find a project that will be meaningful, but that you could do as a resident. So it's not taking up all your time, and that like, I'll make sure that we publish your work. And I got that done as a resident. And so I think for me, I think a lot of it was kind of luck of having great mentors and really driving me into the direction of doing research. it is to be determined how I will find a job in terms of how much effort I am placing into each of these little buckets. But I do like the excitement of being able to do different things. I think, you know, one of my attendings told me this, is that, bench research is really, really, really slow, and you do the same experiment and get different results, and you do it again and again and again. And then you like go on service and you see a patient and you like give them fluids and you make them feel better. And you're like, wow, I feel a lot more productive than I do in the bench. So it's a great balance, at least for me.
Yeah, I think, yeah, I've been in kind of hybrid environments over the years. And some days I would actually physically be in the private office doing kind of clinical radiology. And then sometimes those days when I had to actually go to the hospital and do a noon conference, that was the highlight of my day, interacting with the residents and teaching. And that really was the highlight of my day. And so, yeah, I don't know that I could do strictly private practice. One of my, there's various paths to supplement the clinical practice, but one of my bosses at one point says, clinical work is boring. He was like running the department basically, and he really had zero clinical time, and he spent all his time kind of managing the department, hiring folks, and kind of almost doing the business of radiology. And now he's probably retired, multimillionaire, sold the practice, and but yeah, that was his pathway. Dr. Zhang does real clinical research, grant funded research. I kind of do, all my research was kind of research light. It was kind of, there were interesting cases or I made an observation. I'd end up, many times I would actually have the resident be the first author, and I was okay with being the last author, and I would get credit for it. And then even when I was in the Columbia system, they started out in the Columbia system, and at Columbia they said that, if you're not the first author, but you were supporting a trainee, you got credit. So that's how I started. And then at the Mount Sinai system, they kept it that way, or that, it was the same kind of thing. So hopefully you're at a system where you can be, you'll have attendings with that motivation. They don't have to be the first author. So yeah.
Yeah, and I would encourage you, Rachel, you and everybody else who's kind of thinking about these things to talk to as many people as possible. I realize that, mentorship really is a two-way street, and you have to be a great mentee, but not every mentor is a great mentor for you. And I think it took me talking to a lot of people to kind of see what their pros and cons, and sometimes people's cons may not be your cons, right? Like some people are like, I really hate this part of my job, and you're like, wow, but I like that part of my job. And so I think getting perspectives on what other people are doing kind of gives you a better sense of like what jobs are out there, what are the ups and downs of it, how do you look for them. And I think like I said before, not saying no too early, really being open to different opportunities, and you might surprise yourself about what you do and don't like, particularly, as a medical student, even as a resident, there are a lot of opportunities out there for you to try things, and you're not kind of like stuck in a position at that time when you're a trainee. So I would encourage you to, take a lot of opportunities that you can without burning yourself out.
Could we do the next slide maybe?
Yeah. We can do the next slide.
Maybe one more.
Yeah. Yeah, and this is just an example of kind of what I was talking about, kind of thinking backwards. So, if we start on the right-hand side, my goal was to be a physician scientist who conducts translational research. This makes me sound a lot cooler than I am, I promise. Working in the academic center and being involved in medical education, as well as working in inclusion and equity in medical education curricula. And so then you kind of work backwards, and that middle row is my example of like, so what are your goals, and like what are your to-do lists? And so to be a physician scientist, I'm pursuing my PhD, and so I have a couple of projects that are going on in my PhD. And so within those projects, they all kind of have a meaning for me. You know, the first one is my PhD project. The second one is a clinical project I'm working on that's very related to what I'm trying to specialize in, which is pediatric sarcomas. And then the last one is kind of a middle author project that I've been working on with my postdoc. And so those all kind of go towards this goal that I've set for myself and this kind of career that I see myself in. And these are my to-do lists. And, you know, early on, you know, your goal could be like, figure out if academia is for me, or like figure out if research is for me. And so what are you going to do about that, right? Talk to someone about it, see if you can get involved in a project to just kind of see what the process looks like, you know, jumping into a lab for like a week or two just to kind of see what people do in there, and things like that, and kind of just thinking backwards to all of the things that you're doing in the, you know, very precious time and effort you have as a, you know, a medical student and a resident, and how do you take that and make a meaningful experience out of it. It's really kind of the goal of this exercise. You can go next.
This is amazing, and I'm getting imposter syndrome just looking at all these accomplishments, and I'm getting tired just reading about all. Oh my gosh, I'm exhausted. I'm so happy you broke away to spend an hour with us. Here's some tips on how to seek advice.
Yeah, I think the next couple of slides are just looking at kind of seeking advice and asking about mentorship. And I think, you know, really knowing yourself, really seeing yourself in other people's shoes. And so this is, you know, some advice that I like to give. And I always tell people who come for me for advice, these couple of things is that take everybody's advice with a grain of salt. You don't have to believe everything I say, and you don't have to believe everything, you know, your like department chair or like someone super high up has to say, because everybody comes from a different place, right? Everybody has different experiences of who they are and how they see the world. And so when they give you advice of like, this is what exactly you have to do, it really comes from a place of where they're from, right? Whether or not they have the privilege to do these things in the first place, or, you know, how much imposter syndrome they have, which I have a lot of. So really understanding where that advice comes from is important, and that this quote unquote perfection and like exactly what you need to do is actually very unique to an individual. Next.
I just two comments. I've heard the advice, perfectionist gets nothing done. So sometimes perfectionism can be a problem. And then the other thing with advice, they say, you know, don't take advice from anyone who's never been in the arena themselves, because you know, people just make random comments, but you know, you look at, well, what have you done? And yeah, if they've never been quote in the arena, then never mind.
Yeah, and it's just a thought experiment of considering your closest mentor and who you go to for advice, either for career or personal advice, and thinking about what you have in common. What do you differ from? How do you differ from this person? And what aspects of their life do you want to reflect and take on?
Okay. Now, these are just kind of topics for discussion. You know, the program director had called me, called all my class together. It was like 4 people, and they said, you know, we need 2 chief residents for next year. Any volunteers? And I jokingly say, you know, something like everyone who wants to do it step forward, and it's like 2 people step backwards, and I was left standing in line. And so it was. And in some ways, I think that's actually a good thing. You don't necessarily want to be super eager to be the chief, but and there was one politician or public servant who said, you know, if asked, I will serve. I think that's, well, for me, that was that resonated. That, you know, okay, they presumably you'll just do a good job, and you realize sometimes it's a thankless task and everything like that. And so after my chief year, it was a learning experience, and sometimes I, as a program director, I would kind of push people or not push, but nudge them to be a chief. And especially if sometimes they don't necessarily come off as, being the extroverted, they're almost quiet. But I think they would be one of those kind of quiet leaders. And I think it worked out. And after my chief year, I was thinking, that's it for me in leadership. And then the next thing I know, I'm chief fellow, and then whatever, and section chief of my department and various other leadership positions. So that's Lindy or Dr. Zhang. Any
No.
evolved as leaders? I don't know. I think
Still trying to figure it out for myself. I think really I'm a person of passion, kind of like thinking about what really drives you and what really excites you. And I think it really kind of falls into place and, makes you motivated to want to lead. I think reflecting and learning on what it was like to be someone who was following a leader and kind of thinking about, same with your mentorship, what do you like about them and what aspects of them do you want to reflect and emulate, I think really helps us kind of grow as leaders.
I found the prior presentation interesting. The dean had a lot of insight in leadership regarding, the sometimes folks think about a leader as barking out orders, which is perhaps okay in some of the time, but I think there are perhaps alternative, more effective ways to lead a team. Strengths and weaknesses as a leader. I was more the kind of quiet kind of leader, and actually I had colleagues that would translate for me. I would kind of ask, and do you think you could do XYZ? And then the guy standing there said, what he really means, just do it. So it's kind of funny, but I think over time I was more clearly communicating what needs to be done or convincing folks what needs to be done.
Yeah. And I think Andy had asked the question, how can I go about discovering and understanding my weakness as a leader and then take steps and then steps I can take to overcome them? And Novi had a good answer to that.
Okay. Let's see. So setting boundaries, we touched on this a little bit, but I think, boundaries are important. It's very challenging sometimes when you're the student. But I don't know if there's any examples or folks want to share.
Yeah, have you guys been in a situation where you felt like you wanted to say no, but were unsure?
Actually, I remember one time when I was a junior attending, the kind of more senior attending wanted me to write something up, and I just said no, and it probably was a mistake because I think he took it personally, but that's okay. But yeah, I didn't, So I guess
share an experience. Oh, sorry.
Yeah. Go for it, Rachel.
Thank you. So this isn't exactly an experience that happened with someone older than me. It was actually someone who's a current MS1. I'm an MS2, and so I'm also a peer mentor. And I'm a peer mentor to a first year. And I think it was a really rewarding experience, but I also felt like there were moments where she was getting a bit too comfortable, asking me questions like what can I expect on the next exam? Can you look through these notes and point out any questions that you remember? And as much as I wanted to help her, I mean, I'm also just as busy as she is studying for my own exams. So I just didn't have the time to go through, all the notes. And Also kind of just like tearing at like my moral compass. Like, I don't know if like sharing questions is like exactly the morally right thing to do. So I did have to set a boundary with her, and it was difficult because I considered her a friend of mine, and I didn't want to jeopardize that relationship because I wasn't sharing. Yeah, I wasn't answering the way that she wanted from me, I guess. So that's just an example.
I could also share a story too. This happened when I was an M1, and it had to do with some research projects I was involved with a PI who was very prolific and clearly a great expert in her specialty and in her research interests. But it kind of got to the point where I kept getting assigned papers that I had of projects that I had no involvement in. And I remember at one point she asked me to write like 4 different manuscripts, 3 of which I had no idea what was about. But I soon kind of felt that I was almost being exploited as like writing labor, where I was just kind of writing the drafts and, like my name wasn't first author or anything. And it was just kind of me as an M1, my time being used to kind of write a manuscript that I had no involvement in. So I ended up having to just say no and really try to leave that situation that I felt was becoming very toxic and also not really conducive to learning or good mentorship, because aside from potentially getting my name on some random papers, I was not getting like research guidance or kind of formal mentorship in how to conduct research or how to kind of further my research interests within those topics. And it was a kind of a hard decision because, as you said, there was that power dynamic, but I felt like something just had to be done. And luckily, being a student, you could kind of always use school as a good excuse, and that kind of was effective for me. But I do kind of resonate with the fact that, sometimes you do need to set boundaries even when it may benefit you, but at the same time, like you really have to ask yourself, is this really aligning with my values as a person, as a learner, as a future kind of health practitioner in whatever field that I'm going into?
Yeah. First, I wanted to say 2 things for Rachel. I think, your response was very appropriate. And I always remind myself, as someone who always also really hates conflict and people pleasing, is that you can't control other people's reactions and responses to you. And if you're doing something that is obviously protecting yourself and you're being honest with her, and if she reacts with anger or no longer is your friend, you can't control that. And, you did what was right for yourself. And for Ming, thank you for sharing that. I think, that's always a very hard place to be. And it sounds like you are very self-reflective, and thinking about what this opportunity really meant to you and how it was beneficial, but also harming you, and kind of that balance. And I think that's, the right thing to do, right? To kind of think about whether or not this relationship is mutually beneficial or is starting to cause you harm. I think, one of my advice would have been at the time, if you had another mentor who you were close with, who you could bounce ideas off of, that would be someone to kind of like be like, hey, I'm in this situation and I'm not sure about it. Like, is it something that's common, or is it something that I should be leaving? And I think, it's important to have people in your life to be able to do that with.
So hopefully I've done the trick where you all are still seeing the PowerPoint, and I'm actually now able to look at the chat. And let's see, how can I go about discovering and understanding my weaknesses as a leader? One thing is to try to solicit feedback, and hopefully one thing to do is you have to have an environment where you really have psychological safety and people feel comfortable just, saying things to your face. I mean, it's sometimes as a leader, just as in my role as program director, they felt I was intimidating. And so it's harder to get feedback, but somehow, whether it's evaluations or whatever, try to take it to heart and So that's one thing I think encourage so-called psychological safety. Let's see, there's another comment from Joyce Lee about if somebody's not doing their responsibility, it's sometimes easier to just do it yourself. Sometimes, yeah, you just have to really, in the long run, that's not going to work. So you just almost have to, if it's an emergency thing and a procedure, whatever, you just elbow them aside and do it. But I mean, if it's not life and death, perhaps, or depending on the stakes, you really have to develop your the folks you're responsible for. I don't know, Lindy, Dr. Zhang, have you had any experiences like that?
Yeah, I try and think of a personal experience I've had that with. But mostly I think, having people who, if you've given them feedback and they're not taking your feedback, I think one of the things is to be honest with them and to be like, we've talked about this. And sometimes you just have to, maybe the relationship isn't working, whether it's you as the mentor and your mentee, or I think depending on the project you're working on, and that like maybe this relationship needs to end and someone else needs to teach this individual is always my approach to it. But really kind of having conversation is like, what is it about this relationship that isn't like this isn't working for me? Like, do you feel like it's working for you? Like, how should we fix this? Much like any relationship, right? Like, how do we better communicate so that we can reach a mutual agreement of like what the work needs to look like, and having that conversation. And I think sometimes those conversations are really hard to have, but I think really like putting your cards on the table and telling them exactly why you are frustrated, and potentially maybe they're frustrated too, and that there is some sort of miscommunication in that kind of relationship that you can fix, might be a way to kind of do it. I think, being a leader, I always kind of rely on being honest and transparent, because I think, once people don't feel like you're telling them the truth or you're speaking your mind, it becomes this game of like, oh, like, what are you hiding from me kind of thing, even though you don't intend to.
I mean, the one thing, there's books I've read over the pandemic. There's one, Difficult Conversations, and I think, the books are fine, but in some ways you almost have to just practice. Practice makes perfect, but just yes, have those difficult conversations, or what seem, quote, scary or difficult, and then the more times you do it, it's just easier, I think, the next time. And so it sounds like some of you on the call are actually having had experience, so that good for you. It's really cool to see Jimon Lee is on the call. Oh my gosh, founding father.
He's just watching us.
So I'd love to, reveal yourself and weigh in, throw us some wisdom, man. But yeah, and he's in private practice, or can give the private practice version of all this leadership.
Oh, well, I mean, this is your presentation, so this is Jimin. I'm actually working right now. I'm actually reading mammograms as you're speaking, so I'm just tuning in, and but no, I co-sign everything that you say. You guys are terrific. So,
well, thank you. Good to hear your voice, man.
Thank you.
And we'll see you in Portland.
Yes, you all see me in Portland if you're going to Portland, people. So I think I'm also like one of the elective speakers later on in the series. So.
Okay, cool.
Yes, feel free to drop by. But again, this is your presentation. Keep on going.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Let's see. So how to evaluate unconscious bias and how we actively try to prevent bias. So I've had some experience at Mount Sinai. They have this thing, Howard Ross wrote a book, Everyday Bias, and it's really mostly as it affects race. And I wrote a piece on unconscious bias, or actually actually that piece, I was gifted first authorship. So I guess that's karma, right? Somebody, I was like surprised. He says, "Hey, our paper's been accepted." I was even surprised because I did actually minor stuff, and but anyways, we can just Google Kagetsu and conscious bias, and you can find it, or reach out. I'll send you a PDF. But it is an interesting topic. More recently, or some institutions have unconscious bias training from the diversity departments, but some people are now kind of saying, is that just checking off a box, and we really need to do more to address systemic racism and whatnot. One way to mitigate bias actually is meditation. Or before you act is kind of just to pause and not have such a reflective reaction to whatever you're dealing with. One kind of simple way to reduce bias and perhaps even stress is, I've done this at other sessions, you can even do the square breathing. I probably should have thrown in that slide. But what we're kind of toward the end, but we can just do a little break, semi-break. Everyone, let's just do this square breathing. Sit at the edge of your chair like you're a child ready to receive a present. So you just sit, and then you sit up straight, your back straight. I'm a neuroradiologist, and I see all these degenerative lumbar spines, so why not sit up straight? And I think Zhang Kabat-Zinn, who's one of the mindfulness, wrote the book on mindfulness-based stress reduction. They use the expression, sit up straight with dignity, right? So we can sit up straight with dignity, and then square breathing is you inhale for 4 seconds, you hold your breath for 4 seconds, or count of 4, exhale for 4 seconds, hold your breath for 4 seconds. So, the fire department of New York uses that they teach the firefighters that technique to reduce stress. So if it works for them, it should work for us. So let's just do one or 2 reps. Inhale, 2, 3, 4, hold, 2, 3, 4, exhale, 2, 3, 4, hold, 2, 3, 4. So even though I was counting and not doing it, I still few of those. And one thing is, if you're in a rush, I don't know, try this before you see a patient. You just take one deep breath and sometimes I tell patients, let's take a deep breath in and blow it out slowly, like you're blowing it out through a straw. And then at the same time, since you're very efficient, you can put that hand stuff on your hands and then be visibly rubbing your hands in front of the patient, just to show that you care about them and not giving, you're not one of those doctors that's gonna, ignores the hand hygiene protocol. So I would do that visibly in front of the patient, so you take a deep breath, load up with your hands, and then while you're exhaling, you're rubbing your hands in front of the patient, and then you can say hi, and you're kind of resetting yourself and just focusing and being present for your patient, or whatever, your next meeting or the next person you're talking to. And I'm a fan of that. I'm certainly a fan of doing the hand rub in front of the patient. Being a patient for many times, I actually asked my oncologist once, and like, when do you, he says, oh, I do it after I see the patient. But I'm more of a fan of just to make a display, because he did it after the last patient, but then he touches the doorknob and whatever. I would just make it a display. Okay. Any other tips? How do people avoid bias? It's easier said than done. Be aware of your bias, but just be on this call. There's sometimes I've been on calls and we talk about anti-Black sentiment in the API community and vice versa, right? It is a thing, and I think I was actually on an APAMSA call. Sometimes you'll hear comments from even friends or family members that you just have to kind of call them out and say that's not cool, or right. So I guess that's one way we try to prevent bias, or try to, you know. I think that's it. We're in. That's our last slide. This is we're into Q&A. But and it's 8 o'clock. Okay, that's almost perfect timing. But I'm willing to stay on the line if anyone has questions. I thank Dr. Zhang for your time, and I'm glad you're able to squeeze time out of your schedule. I'm just kind of hanging out, so I have lots of time. My kids are out of the house, and I'm just waiting for my wife to come home to have dinner.
Thank you, Dr. Kagetsu. But if anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to stay behind. But also, if you ever want to email, I'm open to talking about everything and anything all at once.
Right, great movie.
Yes, if anyone has not watched it, it's an amazing movie. And it's really funny. So, because my mom used to work in a laundromat as well. And so it's like very, just like, it was very touching.
I guess I can put in like the last final question for everyone. Because you guys are down in your leadership career and have more experience now, and most of us are still in the beginning of medical school or toward the end. If you had like a time capsule or a time machine and you can go back in time and you're talking to your first newly admitted medical student self, what one tip of advice would you give yourself to that when you're giving it to yourself upon like admission to medical school?
That's a tough question to think. You know, not sure how anxious I was, or actually, you know, I probably never even thought I'd be doing any sort of leadership. It just you're in for an interesting ride, dude. I don't know, because you know, I actually kind of, you know, late in my career, I ended up running for election. I was never one of those folks that would end up running for election and speaking in front of a big crowd and making a spiel. And but I did go. There was a time when, you know, I just speaking in front of a group of 20 or so people, I was sweating bullets, you know. So I somehow overcame that. And in some ways, I guess maybe, you know, it's not having no shame or not caring. There's actually an interesting book that one of our residents, some residents are fans of. It's a Subtle Art of Not Giving an F. There's a lot of F words in the book, but in general, it's good advice. Mark Manson, are you familiar with that book?
Yeah, I think I would tell myself to be less anxious. I don't know, most of you don't know the story, but I am a very high stress, high anxious person, if you haven't noticed already. And I really had a lot of mental health issues going through medical school, and I was diagnosed with generalized anxiety disorder as a medical student. And I remember my psychiatrist had asked me if I ever thought that I could live without this much stress. And I was like, is this not life? But I reflected today as I was kind of thinking about doing this, is that, like, you know, I never imagined myself being in this position. I never imagined myself, you know, doing all the things I've done already and I hope to do, you know, but I look back at my 8th grade yearbook, and below it says Lindy Zhang hopes to one day become a pediatrician, and that's what I did. And that, like, getting into medical school was a huge success, and every one of you will be very successful and will have accomplished a lot and have already accomplished a lot. And I think remembering that is really important, because a lot of us carry a lot of imposter syndrome, myself included. I carry a lot of it, but really recognizing and reminding yourself that, you know, your success and what you do is extra after college. Really, you know, I hope you guys take that to heart.
Right. I kind of jokingly say I have an imposter syndrome because I'm an immigrant, but you know, I was born in Canada, so that doesn't really count. So I'm not really an immigrant. And it's 2 from Canada, so like, really, that's hardly an immigrant. And you know, I'm a physician, but I'm really a radiologist, so does that even count? You know, so, but whatever. I ended up actually doing neuro IR, so procedures that are pretty high stress, so I guess that counts for something. But I jokingly say my what we end up doing today is we actually, I was teaching residents how to stab people in the back or stab people in the back for a living. We did a lumbar puncture on a patient.
I love lumbar punctures.
And I see, yeah. So we both stab people in the back as a part of our jobs. And one day you'll be paid for stabbing people in the back. But takeaways.
And I guess I just wanted to respect everyone's time. And I wanted to share this because I thought it was a really great takeaway and something that I will definitely be doing from Dr. Zhang in terms of how to self-reflect. And with the index card method, listing like identifiers and goals, and then how your activities that you're going to pursue or currently doing to achieve this goal, and then your to-do list. And then you also want to have just know your elevator pitch. And I never thought of this until interview season. So it's definitely something that if I knew a few months earlier, I would have had it all set and ready. So thank you. And I hope everyone just take a screenshot of this and just make your own little index cards with this going forward. And thank you everyone for joining. If there's any like last minute questions, feel free to ask now and unmute yourself.
Andy, may I suggest turning off the recording since it's the hour is up, and then we can have a hang on till I can hang on till my wife gets home, or if you really, we can just stop. What is this link you sent?
Yeah, so I was going to say it's